مشاهدينا الكرام، أهلا وسهلا بكم في هذه المقابلة الخاصة التي تأتيكم من استديوهاتنا في مقر الأمم المتحدة في نيويورك، ونستضيف من خلالها عبر الأثير من موسكو سيرجي لافروف وزير خارجية الاتحاد الروسي في هذه الفترة العصيبة والخطرة من النزاع المسلح في أوكرانيا، والتي تهدد السلم والأمن الدوليين في العالم أجمع. Mr. Sergey Lavrov, Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation, welcome to Al-Arabiya and Al-Hadath.
Thank you.
I would like to start with the question of security that many say is at the heart of this conflict. What kind of binding guarantees Russia would accept for its own security in order to stop the current Russian special military operations in the Ukraine? And in return, what guarantees should the Ukrainians have for their own security, independence, and freedom?
We have provided many proposals. During all these years, we have been initiating draft treaties, draft agreements with NATO, with countries of Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. And lately, in December last year, we proposed another initiative to the United States and to NATO to conclude treaties with both of them on security guarantees to all countries in the Euro-Atlantic space without joining any military alliance. Every time we initiated these steps, they were basically rejected with more or less polite behavior. In 2009, we proposed European Security Treaty, which NATO refused to consider. And the treaty actually was about codifying something to which all OSCE countries subscribed at the top level. The presidents and heads of governments signed in Istanbul in 1999, and then in 2010 in Astana, special declarations committing themselves to indivisible and equal security, stating that yes, each country has the right to choose its alliances, but at the same time, no country can strengthen its security at the expense of the security of other countries, and that no single organization in Europe can pretend to be predominant player in this geopolitical space. We just suggested that those political commitments solemnly adopted at the top level, at the highest level, at the summits, to be codified and to be made legally binding. In 2009, this was the first attempt. NATO told us that there would be no legally binding security guarantees outside NATO, which means that what they signed up in OSCE, their presidents, their prime ministers, that this was just lip service. We tried again later, and I said there were several attempts, and the last one took place in December last year when we once again proposed to stop the tension, to stop building tension, increasing tension and confrontation during all these years when NATO, in spite of its promises of its leaders, was moving closer and closer to the Russian border. And they were telling us, don't be afraid, we're a defensive alliance, and we will pose no threat to your security. Defensive alliance it was, when there was a Berlin Wall made of concrete and geopolitical wall between NATO and the Warsaw Treaty. But when the Warsaw Treaty disappeared, when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, NATO decided that the line of defense should be moved to the east. And they did move this line of defense 5 times. Now listen what Stoltenberg was saying last year already, that NATO has a global responsibility for security, especially in Indo-Pacific region. So my hunch is that the next line of defense of NATO would be in South China Sea, especially since leaders of the of the NATO members, like Foreign Secretary of Britain, Ms. Truss, one of these days stated that NATO must be a global player. So we can listen for so many times about the defensive nature of this alliance, but this is a lie. So the proposals which we submitted last December, they suggested that we all give security guarantees and subscribe to security guarantees which would ensure safety and security of Ukraine and all other European countries, and of course of the Russian Federation. They were made available, they are public, so you can see that this was an honest proposal which was rejected because NATO did not want to sacrifice what they call the policy of open doors, the open doors policy. While such principle does not exist in the Washington Treaty, the Washington Treaty says that all NATO members, by consensus, might and might not invite any country to join, provided this country will satisfy NATO criteria and, which is even more important, will add to NATO security. NATO expansion in the last years, I don't think it was related to this very important criteria. What kind of security was added to NATO by pulling Macedonia and some other countries in Montenegro? So it was all a cover to promote NATO expansionist plans. The latest security guarantees discussion is taking place, if we come back to Ukraine, which was made during all these years an instrument to contain Russia and to deter Russia and to irritate Russia. When for the last years the regimes in Kyiv were canceling everything Russian, the language, education, media, and even day-to-day use of the Russian language was made an administrative offense. When they were codifying legislation, promoting and encouraging Nazist theories and practices, and when they were pumping arms into Ukraine, when they supported the illegal anti-constitutional coup d'etat in February 2014, to which Crimean citizens and the citizens in the east of Ukraine responded by refusing to live under the rule of the people who violated guarantees from European Union, by the way, because the coup happened next morning after a deal was signed between the opposition and the president and guaranteed by the European Union, France, Germany, and Poland. They just staged this bloody coup and basically spat into the face of the European Union. They treated the European Union the same way as Victoria Nuland did when in December 2013 she talked to her ambassador in Kyiv and told him what should be done to the European Union. I cannot say this in this conversation. So when the Ukrainian regime intensified at the end of last year and early this year, shelling of the eastern territories of the country in Donbass, in gross violation of the Minsk agreements, which was signed in February 2015 and endorsed by the Security Council resolution, when they were targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, kindergartens, we didn't have any other choice. All these years, we were hoping that the West will insist on Kyiv's implementation of the Minsk agreements. The West proved that it was not at all interested in peaceful resolution of this crisis on the basis of the Minsk agreements, which provided special status to these territories. But what the West needed is to support blindly anything which Kyiv regime is doing if it is aimed against the Russian interest. This was and this still is the purpose of our Western friends. So when in February this year, when the two republics once again appealed for us to recognize them, we didn't have any other choice. So we did recognize them. We started at the request the operation of our military contingent to protect them, to protect the lives of the civilians, and to make sure that there is no threat to their lives, to their security, and to the security of Russian Federation emanating from Ukrainian territory. And we do participate in negotiations. When President Zelensky offered, soon after the special operation began, when he offered to start negotiations, we agreed immediately, and we, I think, have been negotiating in very good faith, unlike the Ukrainian negotiators who changed their position every time. From one day to another day, they can be saying diametrically opposed things. But the guarantees which are being discussed, they actually are contained in the drafts which were prepared by the Russian Federation, taking into account the position of Ukrainians. And had they been honest negotiators, had they been faithful to what they agree on a step-by-step basis, we could have moved quite considerably in those negotiations, and the Ukraine would basically be given guarantees from a group of countries, which it originally identified as P5, plus Germany, Turkey, maybe somebody else, and we don't have anything against it. The main thing is to understand how consistent they are, especially as regards the territory on which these guarantees would be applied. You can understand that we cannot accept guarantees to cover Crimea, for example, and to cover the east of Ukraine, which we recognized as independent republics. And they agreed originally, when the negotiators met in Istanbul, that the security guarantees should not be applied to Crimea and to the east of Ukraine. But then they changed their mind again. So we are stuck because of this inconsistency, because of their desire to play games every time, and as far as I can guess, because of the instructions they get from Washington, from London, from some other capitals, not to accelerate the negotiating process.
When the special military operations, as you call it, started on the 4th of February, Russia described Ukraine joining the NATO alliance as an existential threat to Russia. You stated in an interview to Russian TV this week, and I will just read your quote, "If the US and its allies continue to arm the Ukraine, the risk of war escalating into nuclear conflict should not be underestimated." And I hear, forgive me, I took it from a translation of your Russian answer. And I noticed that you called it war in this case, said the war escalating. A nuclear conflict is an existential threat to us all, of course, something that Russia tried to stop in the first place by starting its special military operations in the Ukraine. Did these operations deliver the wrong message or missed its targets by eliminating this existential threat?
Well, actually, you quoted some of my statements. It is not actually a very accurate quotation. I was asked whether nuclear war is possible, whether the risks of nuclear war became closer and more acute, and whether Russia allows for such an eventuality. What I said was absolutely different. I said that from the very beginning of our cooperation with the Trump administration, we have been proposing to them to reiterate what Reagan and Gorbachev stated in 1987, namely to issue a joint Russian-American declaration at the top level, saying that there could be no winners in a nuclear war, and therefore it must never be launched.
So you didn't say the risk of the war escalating into a nuclear conflict should not be underestimated.
Wait a second. I said that we have been champions of making pledges by all nuclear countries never to start a nuclear war. We could not persuade the Trump administration, they were hesitant, but the Biden administration agreed and they understood the importance of such a declaration. So in June last year in Geneva, at the Russian-American summit, this declaration was made. And then again, on the Russian initiative, in January this year, all 5 nuclear states issued the statement of the presidents and the heads of government. And then I said, it is not us who is playing with this word, nuclear war. You remember in January this year, Zelensky, when he was again mobilizing Western support against Russia in his Russophobic policies, when he was saying that nobody is going to change the policy on the Russian language and Russian media, and that nobody will be persecuting the neo-Nazis battalions who were supported by the state and openly wearing the swastika and symbols of Waffen-SS divisions. And then he said, Ukraine made a mistake when it refused to be nuclear power. And he said, we might think about having nuclear weapons again. Recently, a Polish Prime Minister stated that Poland will welcome if nuclear weapons of the United States are moved from Germany to the Polish territory. We never were playing with such dangerous things. That's what I said, that we all should insist on the statements made by the P5. Never, ever, there could be a nuclear war. But to make sure that this is the case, the West must discipline speakers like our Ukrainian and Polish colleagues who see no danger in playing with such very, very risky words. That's what I meant.
Okay, because it came across like threatening words, and this was actually widely spread in the media, and it's... sorry, go ahead.
It did not come across. It was played the way which you describe. We know how indecent those who set the tone for the Western media policy, how indecent they are. So we're used to it.
So it's not. You don't think it was just a wrong translation? A wrong translation.
I just explained what I said.
No, I understand.
And I just gave you specific examples of the statements basically inviting the discussion of a possibility of nuclear war coming from Ukrainians and from Poland.
Yes, because it really was very surprising considering the role played by Russia in promoting in the Security Council in January the announcement and the statement by the heads of state and the presidents. I come to here...
The statement initiated by Russia.
No, I understand.
Don't forget it. Don't forget this.
No, I just said that. Promoted by Russia, and it's commendable action, actually. Okay. And that's why we were surprised to hear such a statement being circulated in the West. Maybe it's just a wrong translation by the translator. Does Russia consider itself at war now with NATO inside the Ukraine because of the large, continuous advance arms shipments to the Ukraine forces?
We don't consider ourselves at war with NATO, because this exactly would be another step, to increase the risks of what we just discussed. Unfortunately, NATO, it seems, considers itself to be at war with Russia. NATO and European Union leaders, many of them in England, in the United States, Poland, France, Germany, and of course, European Union chief diplomat Josep Borrell, they bluntly, publicly, and persistently say Putin must fail, Russia must be defeated. When you use this terminology, I believe you think that you are at war with the person whom you want to be defeated. Yes, they're supplying arms to Ukraine. We know the routes which are used for these purposes, and as soon as these weapons are reaching Ukrainian territory, they are fair game for our special operation.
I ask you this question because there are many who fear that one day they wake up and hear the news that a NATO plane has been downed by Russian forces or a NATO ship has been sunk by Russian forces, accusing them of transferring arms to the Ukraine, hence risking a major escalation in the conflict.
As I said, any weapon, any arms shipment on Ukrainian territory is legitimate target, because these weapons would be given to the regime who has a war against its own population, who conducts military offensive against civilians in the east of the country.
The intensifying Russian operations in the Donbass, what is your ultimate aim in eastern Ukraine besides what has been announced that Russia aimed to protect the two self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk republics?
I told you already that our aim is to protect these two republics because they have been under attacks from Ukrainian regime for a long 8 years. They never, when the coup happened in 2014, they said that they don't want to have anything to do with these people who came to power illegally. And they said, leave us alone. We want to understand what is going on. They never attacked the rest of Ukraine. And they were announced terrorists, and an anti-terrorist operation was launched by the putschist leaders who came to power by force through illegal means. And for the long 8 years, they have been victims of Ukrainian aggression, killing like 13 or 14,000 civilians, destroying civilian infrastructure, and many other crimes were committed by the Ukrainian regime against them. So the goal of our operation, it was announced openly, is to protect these two republics and to make sure that no threat will ever emanate from the Ukrainian territory to the security of these people and to the security of the Russian Federation. This was a response to what NATO was doing in Ukraine to prepare this country for a very aggressive posture against the Russian Federation. They were given offensive arms, including the arms which can reach the Russian territory. Military bases were being built, including on the Sea of Azov, and many other dozens of exercises, military exercises, including many of them on Ukrainian territory, were conducted under NATO auspices, and most of those exercises were designed against the interests of the Russian Federation. So the purposes of this operation is to make sure that those plans do not materialize.
I heard what you said, but what would you say to military analysts who say that Russian army wants to have full control over Donbass and southern Ukraine to provide a land corridor to Crimea? The Ukrainian admitted last Wednesday some losses in the areas they control in the Donbass, but how does Russia foresee this battle developing, and what do you say about what these analysts argue?
The military means to achieve those goals is not for me to discuss, and it is not for the discussion, in response to any speculation by any military expert. Military experts are paid to speculate. Let them continue.
Do you expect the Donbass operations to be completed by May the 9th, the annual commemoration of the end of the Second World War II?
It will be completed as soon as the goals which I just described to you have been implemented and have been achieved.
Last Wednesday, an ammunition depot in Russia, Belgorod, forgive my pronunciation, Belgorod region, bordering the Ukraine, caught fire with several explosions. 2 fires broke out in 2 fuel storage depots in Bryansk region on Monday. These attacks on oil storage facilities have been reported since the 1st of April. Do you attribute these escalating attacks inside Russian territories against military supplies routes and depots to increasing Ukrainian capabilities?
Yeah, the Russian Ministry of Defense presented the information on these situations, some of which were just accidents, some were the result of Ukrainian helicopter attack, and this, of course, made us to understand that the goals of the military operation, which I described to you, must be achieved sooner rather than later. And I can assure you that during the course of this military operation, these adventures by the Kyiv regime are taken care of.
I would like to move the conversation to the sanctions. Russia has become the most sanctioned country in the world, deposing Iran from the first spot. These sanctions are many, varied, and considerable, and continue to intensify. How long can Russia resist these painful sanctions? And they are painful by any standard. The US and its NATO allies believe that these sanctions will incentivize Russia to sit down on the negotiating table in good faith to compromise and reach an acceptable outcome that with solid security guarantees for all. Are they right in their assumption?
Well, they are not very smart, and they certainly don't know history. After the Soviet Union disappeared, the profession of Sovietologist or Russologist disappeared as well. The West thought, the United States thought that Russia, after the Soviet Union disappeared, Russia was in the pocket of the United States. Therefore, there is no need to study Russia. Russia would be doing what it is told. It's not going, it was not the case, of course, as you know. And the sanctions is not something which we saw out of the blue. Sanctions have been with us for decades. We never lived a day in the history of the Soviet Union or the history of the Russian Federation when there were no sanctions. When we were entering WTO, there was a deal, and the Americans understood that they cannot accept WTO entry by Russia without waiving the Jackson-Vanik Act, which was discriminatory and which was not in line with WTO standards, and they wanted us to be in the World Trade Organization. But removing the Jackson-Vanik Act, they immediately replaced it with Magnitsky Act. So there was never interruption in the sanctions regime against the Russian Federation. And after Crimeans refused to remain in a ultra-radical Ukraine under the rule of the Nazi regime, they, as you know, adopted more and more sanctions, and these sanctions never stopped. They were increasing them every 6 or 12 months. So to believe that this latest outrage and the wave of sanctions, which eventually showed the real face of the West, which, as far as I now understand, has always been Russophobic. To believe that this latest wave of sanctions is going to make Russia cry uncle and to beg, for being pardoned, those planners are lousy, and of course they they don't know anything about foreign policy of Russia, and they don't know anything about how to deal with Russia. We will conclude, and we concluded already, one basic thing. We cannot rely on the West in anything, especially in the areas of life, economy, technology, food, other day-to-day requirements, which are of strategic nature. We will never say that we will not have any relations with anybody. If people understand that they were hugely mistaken and that they were hugely wrong, we can foresee that there might be some resumption of relations down the road. But in any case, we must be self-sufficient in those sectors, as I said, which are key to the existence and to the life of the Russian Federation. And I can assure you that the fact that the Americans and others are running all over the world, all over the globe, threatening people, telling them to join sanctions, to vote against Russia. Look, I think it's not dignified for any self-respectful country. It's like they tell you, what they mentioned recently, Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman. She said, when India was discussed, and India was given some attention in the context of what is going on in Ukraine and around it, she said, we must help India to understand what is good for its security. How do you like this? It's not to some island, small country. It's said to India. The same is publicly said to China. China must play the rules. Somebody in the UK, I think the foreign secretary said, China must respect the rules, otherwise it would be punished. Publicly, without even blushing, So the nature of this colonial attitude is absolutely unacceptable. And these people, tell us that this is the fight between democracies and autocracies. What kind of democracies are they if they don't give a damn about democracy in international relations? They just say that you must obey to us. They are not even autocrats, they are dictators. And they threaten punishment to the people, to the countries who would not join their policies. It's a shame. It's a shame, and it's a shame for the Western civilization if it takes the shape of such action.
The Ukraine conflict effect on world food security. The conflict has a very negative effect on food security in many countries, especially in my region and also many countries around the world. And those with small economies. How do you view the negative effect that these special operations and military operations in Ukraine has developed?
Even you have been brainwashed, I understand. The food crisis started not this year, not 2 months ago. The food crisis started several years ago for several reasons, including coronavirus infection, but also including miscalculation of Western countries. They were too much concerned with directing food supply chains in their direction. And of course, the current situation aggravated the problem, but not because Russia eventually didn't have any other choice but to defend itself and its allies from Ukrainian regime, but because the sanctions which the West announced, they broke all supply chains in most cases. For example, dozens of foreign vessels are kept in the Black Sea and Azov Sea ports of Ukraine because they are under sanctions. We are ready to let them go. Ukrainian government is not cooperating. They mind the waters, as you know, and there are mines all over the place. But we are ready to clear the mines and let the ships go. Some of them are with food, as far as I understand. But the sanctions, this is about Ukrainian lack of cooperation and letting foreign ships to leave their ports, but the sanctions prohibited Russian ships to go anywhere, prohibited any logistical infrastructure use by the Russian companies. So if they want to see the real reason of this food crisis, they have to look in the mirror. Actually, when Antonio Guterres was here a few days ago, I raised the issue with him because he published a report about food, energy, and financial crisis. And I told him that it was a shame that he never mentioned sanctions as the key reason for interruption of food supply chains. And you know what he told me? I hope he's not going to be angry with me. I'm not revealing a secret. He said, yes, it was not mentioned in the report, but at a press conference when I was presenting this report, I was asked about it, and I said that, of course, sanctions also played a role. Judge for yourself.
I understand, and I agree with you. The situation was bad before the war, but the war or the special military operations certainly did not help either. I'd like to move to the conflict effect on the world energy markets. And only on Wednesday of this week, Russia suspended gas exports to Bulgaria and Poland due to absence of payments in rubles. Are Bulgaria and Poland only the first ones in Europe, and we can expect more suspensions of supplies?
You know what happened? The contracts which have been signed before this situation, they provided payments in dollars or euros, and these payments were made directly to Gazprom accounts. And this money was held on Gazprom accounts in Western banks. Well, after the beginning of the special operation in Ukraine, our Western friends have stolen more than $300 billion from us. In fact, they stole what they paid to us for gas. In other words, they have used during all these years Russian gas for free. And to avoid continuation of this robbery, we issued the decree of the president, which said, gentlemen, ladies, from now on, you would be paying not to Gazprom and to its accounts in the Western banks, but you would be paying to Gazprom Bank, still in dollars and in euros. Nothing would change. You pay the same amount of foreign currency, which is agreed in the contract. And then inside Gazprom Bank, your euros and your dollars would be moved to the ruble account, and then Gazprom would be paid in rubles. This is absolutely necessary scheme to avoid continuation of shameless robbery in which these countries engaged. You might have heard that in London, Washington, and Brussels, they speak about confiscating the money which they've frozen and giving this money to somebody else. It's, you remember how the United States was created through the golden fever. First come, first served. Who should first is winning. We don't want to be part of this game, and we don't want to be part of this robbery. they have a choice. They either pay the same amount in the same currency as they used to do, and then the rest would be done almost automatically. Or if they don't want us to get the money, and those who refuse to use this ruble scheme, they basically don't want us to get the money for our product. This is their choice. Most key partners of Russia agreed to the scheme which I described. If Poland and Bulgaria put their ideological ambitions higher than the interest of their population, than the interest of their budget, it's up to them.
Less than a week ago, Turkey has closed its airspace to Russian planes coming from Syria and heading to Russia. Some analysts again argue that this is because Russia are transferring Syrian mercenaries to fight in the Ukraine. Is Russia using mercenaries, Syrian or otherwise, in the war?
Never, never, ever we use mercenaries. And I can assure you that people in Syria are busy with their own business.
So why did Turkey close their airspace to Russian planes?
We cooperate with Turkey on many things, and I can assure you that we understand each other on each and every issue which we discuss, because for a change, you know, Turkey and Russia are partners who respect each other's interests and who never impose anything on another partner.
So they gave an explanation. They gave
explanation. I can assure you that we know how to promote the tasks being resolved in the Syrian Arab Republic.
I would like to move to the alleged use of biological and chemical activities in Ukraine. The Russian mission here at the United Nations and its ambassador, Vasily Nebensia, have been active promoting allegations inside and outside the Security Council that the Pentagon has funded a number of biological and chemical labs, not only in the Ukraine, but in other countries, including some countries in the Middle East, in my region. And according to the Chinese foreign minister spokesman, the US has 336 labs in 30 countries. How do you see this file unfolding? And it is noteworthy that the US permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, has vehemently denied these allegations and poured praise on the joint disease research between the Ukraine and the US.
A simple answer is they lie. The simple answer is it is not allegation. It is documented, and the documents have been discovered by the Russian military operation participants when they entered the respective territories of Ukraine. It is also not just the statement by the Chinese Foreign Ministry that they have dozens of laboratories. They do have about 30, did have about 30 laboratories run by the Pentagon Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And the documents found, the documents discovered and made available in the United Nations, they prove beyond any reasonable doubt that what they have been doing in Ukraine, in those Pentagon military biological laboratories, was against the Convention on Prohibition of Biological and Toxin Weapons, beyond any doubt. And it is not by incident that the political scientists in the United States, experts, are now trying to have a discussion to understand what exactly the Americans were doing in Ukraine and in other parts of the world, because they have, if you take the global spread, it's hundreds of military biological laboratories. And it is not by chance that Victoria Nuland, when she was testifying in Congress, she said, we did everything not to allow these pathogens to get into the hands of the Russian Federation. She basically confessed that what they were doing was not peaceful. And they create these laboratories around the Russian Federation, around China. They even have been, we have information that they have been trying to pull Mongolia in this game. And with all our neighbors, we negotiate memoranda or agreements with several countries. We signed this already on cooperation in biological security, making pledges that Russian biological security, biological scientific sites, and their biological scientific science would be transparent and would be subject to mutual exchange of visits. By the way, this activities of the United States, which most probably are direct violation of the convention, is an explanation why the Americans single-handedly have been blocking our proposal, supported by basically all others, to create a verification mechanism in the context of the Biological Weapons Convention. Since 2001, we have been trying to get this through, and the Americans block it.
Your forces have been in the Ukraine since the 24th of February for more than 2 months. Did they find any bioweapons or research centers for weapons, biological weapons, while they're there?
Yes, as I said, we discovered documentation. We discovered samples which are being analyzed, and this information, I think, most of it has been already presented to the United Nations. They are keeping in those laboratories most dangerous pathogens, including pathogens of plague, anthrax, cholera, brucellosis, and others. And those are very dangerous, substances. So we don't have any doubt that this must be investigated, and we will continue to do this. And we have reasons to believe that biological weapons and chemical weapons is something which we need to emphasize much more in discussions with the United States, insisting that they must publicly explain why they once again prolonged their pledge, their commitment to destroy all chemical weapons, why they build those military biological laboratories without agreeing to have verification and transparent mechanism under the Convention on Biological Weapons, and many other things. We want clarity, and we would insist on answers.
Talking about the UN, will this military conflict lead to the demise of the United Nations? How will this conflict affect the multilateral diplomacy, the principle that the United Nations is built on? You served here for 9 years and 10 months, and you know this organization better than anybody else. Do you think this organization is now facing an existential threat and might go the way the League of Nations before it?
Yes, it might. It might if we continue to watch the activities of the West, led by the United States, to move away the discussion on important issues from the United Nations into closed, non-inclusive formats. Summit for Democracies, which was convened by President Biden last year. The invitees were individually decided by Washington. And of course, you find the very funny countries whom the Americans never described as democratic, but they were invited to the Summit of Democracies because they were obedient servants of Washington, or they were considered to be obedient servants. Then, a few years ago, the French and the Germans announced the creation of Alliance of Multilateralists. And we asked them why to do it outside the United Nations, because what is more multilateral than the United Nations? Everybody is here, except few non-recognized states, but it's a universal organization. They told us, no, we need something separate, because in the United Nations there are many autocratic countries. Yes, autocratic countries they are. There are also monarchies, and we explain to them this is the pluralistic picture of the world community. And if you want to be multilateral, then you cannot avoid including everybody. No, but they created an alliance of multilateralists, which is based on, as they said, European Union values. Many initiatives like this, about a dozen initiatives on freedom of the media, cybersecurity, has been announced by European countries outside the United Nations, in spite of the fact that there are special institutions under UN umbrella, which are universal and which are devoted to the same topics. But the main thing is democracy, but democracy in international relations. If you want to have an honest relationship, it should be like, you know, the United States said what it thinks. The Russian Federation stated what it thinks. China and everybody else, India, Egypt, Turkey, South Africa, Brazil, everybody presents its positions like it should be in the General Assembly general debate. And then countries who listen, they should decide whose view is closer to them. This is democratic way of proceeding, and then building some consensus, compromises, so that everybody has its position reflected in a common document. The Americans act in the United Nations very differently. They just dictate. They threaten people. They threaten countries, tell them if you don't do as I tell you, we will cut assistance to your country.
But to be honest, many countries use these methods.
They tell individual ambassadors, if you don't vote the way I want, don't forget that you have an account in an American bank. Don't forget that your son is studying in American university. I am not joking. I have some friends who have been suffering from this kind of treatment. But the key issue is United Nations Charter. It says the United Nations is based on the principle of sovereign equality of states. Analyze what the Americans are doing all over the world, and you will immediately come to the conclusion that they don't give a damn to respecting this principle.
But many countries are accusing you, sir, and accusing Russia of abandoning the charter by invading or by sending forces inside an independent, recognized state, which is the Ukraine, and a member of the United Nations.
Do they believe that the Americans were right to go in Iraq, to go in Syria, to bomb Libya?
Two wrongs don't make a right, sir.
Why? No. You know, when the United States declares that there is a threat to the United States 10,000 kilometers from the border of the United States, everybody, some people were grumbling, some were expressing their concern, but there was no hysteria like the one we witnessed today, when Russia, having warned for many, many years that this is going to be a problem, that we cannot tolerate a threat which NATO and the United States have been building just on our borders, not 10,000 kilometers away. You know, there was one interesting message I saw in Telegram from the Middle East, by the way. They say if you cannot sleep because of Russia-Ukrainian conflict, there are some advices to calm you down. First, imagine that this is happening in Africa. Imagine this is happening in the Middle East. Imagine Ukraine is Palestine. Imagine Russia is the United States. One other joke at the end. Somehow it is about Estonia, but it's a joke about Estonian zoo. In a zoo in Estonia, there is a pool, and there are crocodiles in the pool. and a mother with a young kid is watching the crocodile, and then there is a guy who drinks beer and watches around. Then somehow the kid has fallen out and fell into the pool. And the guy jumped into the pool and saved the kid and gave it to the mother. She said, "Oh, thank you very much. You are a very brave Estonian guy." He said, "Unfortunately, I'm not Estonian, I am Russian." Next morning, Estonian newspapers were headlined, "A drunk Russian deprived the crocodile of its dinner."
I'd like to stay at the United Nations. The Secretary General has visited you on Tuesday and had a meeting with you and later with President Putin, and he came with two proposals. First, the establishment of a humanitarian contact group bringing together Russia, Ukraine, and the United Nations to look at opportunities for the opening of safe humanitarian corridors. And secondly, on Mariupol, Secretary Guterres proposed coordinated work to be carried out by the United Nations, the International Committee for the Red Cross, and the Ukrainian and Russian forces.
There is no need. I know. There is no need in anybody providing help to open humanitarian corridors. There is only one problem. Humanitarian corridors, which are being announced on a daily basis, are ignored by the Ukrainian ultranationals who are sitting in this steel mill in the outskirts of Mariupol. And the Kiev regime either does not order them to let civilians go if there are some civilians, or the Kiev regime cannot tell them what to do and does not have any authority over them. We appreciated the interest of the Secretary General to be helpful, and we agreed that his people, he has his representatives for a couple of months already in Russia. They work with the Ministry of Defense to coordinate the delivery of humanitarian convoys. And these people have been explained yesterday and today what is the mechanism for them to monitor how the humanitarian corridors are announced and how the humanitarian corridors offers are responded to by the people who keep, if there are civilians, then civilians are being kept as a human shield.
Moldova, do they have anything to worry about from special military operations from Russia?
They should worry about their own future because they're being pulled into NATO, and I don't think this would add security to Moldova. The goals of the Russian operation in Ukraine have been announced. They are to protect civilians in the east of Ukraine and to make sure that there are no threats to those civilians or to the Russian Federation coming from the Ukrainian territory. Full stop.
After the guns have been silenced one day, and hopefully soon, after all the destructions, killing, displacement of people inside and outside the Ukraine, after all the accusations, counter-accusations, after the strong rhetorics and allegations from both sides, can the two neighboring Ukraine and Russian peoples restore the trust to live side by side in peace and cooperation as they did in the past? Or is it already too late for that for the foreseeable future?
I have no slightest doubt that the two peoples would live in peace and good neighborly relations.
Mr. Sergey Lavrov, Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation, we thank you for this special interview and we thank you for the insights. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
وهكذا وصلنا مشاهدينا الكرام إلى نهاية هذه المقابلات الخاصة مع سيرجي لافروف وزير خارجية الاتحاد الروسي. نشكر لكم كرم المتابعة وحتى نلتقيكم ثانية نترككم في أمان الله.